All right, guys, here we are back again for part 2 of our in-depth Storm Arena Sagat review. And it's time, the time you've all been waiting for. It's the one-to-one comparison with Jada Toys Sagat. They're both standing here in their neutral poses. They're looking nice. They're looking great. But let's get into the differences here. First, we're going to talk about sculpt and aesthetics. Then we're going to move on to articulation, and we will end it with a pose off and some final thoughts. So we're going to try to keep this one quick. We're not going to touch on all the articulation and everything, since the in-depth review, I touched on a lot of that. We're only really going to focus on the things that are different in the two. So first off, in sculpt, you know we love the Storm Arena Sagat sculpt. He's menacing. His musculature looks fantastic. The sculpt is deep, it's angular, it's badass. Man, the details are phenomenal. The sculpt is so good on the Storm Arena Sagat. And just overall, his finish feels much more premium in the paint, in the plastic, and things like flashing and little pieces that might be hanging and stuff like that. I think the Storm Arena does a much better job. You can see in our Jada, still a good looking figure, but you're going to see a lot of the flashing in the joint, as well as on some of the figure. It's just a little less premium of a finish overall. So Storm Arena is, I think, definitely going to take the aesthetics and finish. It's just definitely a more premium offering. Now let's move on to articulation. I'm not going to touch on all the points of articulation. I'm going to really just touch on the points where they differ greatly. The first being the butterfly joints. We can do a quick test of the Storm Arena's butterfly joint here. He has that soft chest piece, which really allows him to extend an extra few degrees there. You can see he can easily cross his arms. And that is a nice range forward for his butterfly. Now, I will say, as I mentioned in the previous comparison video, that because of the soft piece and because of the way he's engineered, when you're extending him fully, you do get these large unsightly gaps, which isn't my favorite thing if you are into figure photography or posting online your poses. This just doesn't look quite as nice, but still he's getting a really good range of motion forward there. Now let's compare that to the Jada. All right, so there is the Jada Sagat at his max forward extension with the butterflies. So you can see there, the Storm definitely takes it moving forward. It gets a nice range and ability to cross his arms pretty easily, but again, just a little less clean in doing so. Now let's go ahead and look at his extension backwards in the butterflies, so Storm Arena. And sometimes this the soft chest piece can get in the way a bit. As you can see here, it's can sometimes sort of bunch up and limit, but there he is with his backwards range for his butterflies. Go ahead and test the Jada, which his butterflies, you can see where that cut ends there, so you know where to stop. And there is his backwards range. So you can see the difference there, where the Jada definitely gets a good amount more of extension on those butterfly joints going backwards. And again, I just have to point out that it just kind of does it a little cleaner. Again, we're looking at those gaps in the Storm Arena when you start to extend it fully. But, because they both have their advantages here, I'm going to call that one even, actually. I think the Jada going back much more, the Storm going forward much more. I'm going to call that an even. Now we're going to move on to the notorious ab crunch, which if you've seen my review, if you've seen the preview photos, you might already know where this is heading, but let's go ahead and see the Storm Arena Sagat. There you have that. The Jada already getting just a little bit more range from that top ab crunch. Now we're going to do the bottom of the Storm. And as you can see, I'm I'm really pushing that there. We're gonna get his arms out of the way just so you can see that a little better. But there you go. There's his extension forwards from that ab crunch. And we're gonna test the Jadas using the bottom. So there you go. You can see the difference there. We're utilizing both ab crunches. The Jada gets far more range in the abdomen. Now let's go ahead and take a look at their backwards ab range. And we're just going to utilize both here. We're not going to do one each. So that is max backwards extension. And that's even, hold on, let me fix his hips here. You want to get that line straight. There we go. You can see the line is straight there. And guys, that is this. His head likes to keep popping off. I don't know if it's, feels like the ball peg's actually a little too short. But all right, so there's his extension backwards for Storm Arena Sagat. And now we're going to do the same for Jada. And I mean, this one honestly is night and day. You can see the range of motion from the abdomen and waist with the Jada figure. And he's getting, 20, 30 degrees more, which, as I said, any, 3 to 5 degrees more in these kinds of figures are going to really affect how dynamic the poses can look. So you really want an ab crunch like that when you're trying to do dynamic posing, which, I mean, do I really have to say it? You know who takes the ab crunch. That one is a pretty clear winner if you ask me. So next, we are going to talk about the hip articulation. Now, this is something that I talked about in my previous comparison videos that I think people really didn't understand. And what it is, we're going to be testing the articulation from the hips and its ability to move upwards and backwards and really give him dynamic kicking and tiger knee poses. So I think it is something that is worth noting, especially with a character like Sagat, where he needs to get into those kinds of poses. And what we're going to do is bring his foot from the hip upwards without it kicking out. As I said, the Storm Arena figures from their hips, they want to start kicking out to get some of that range. And that is him maxed out range, utilizing just the hip. And, he hits 90 degrees, I would say, pretty well. So that's not terrible. Now let's go ahead and do the test with our Jada figure, which again, I would say about right there before it wants to start kicking out. He gets maybe just slightly more range on that 90 degree, maybe just slightly above 90 degree. I mean, we can call it 90. That's really not the issue here. The issue is when you want to start pushing that articulation further. So say I want Sagat to do a cool move where he's high kicking maybe up to his head range. Now here's where my issue lies with it. So if I'm going to kick it, the way this crotch piece and the bulkiness of the legs really, like this is, I'm trying to hit it straight up and it's forcing itself outward. So to get him to kick even kind of close to his head range or shoulder range, he has to kick that far outwards. Now, if you compare that to what the Jada figure does, if you give him a little leeway to kick outwards like that, let's see if we can get him to kick up to his head and shoulder range. We're going to push up straight. You can see right there already, he's kicking up to his shoulder or head range because of the way the hip and the crotch piece is designed. As you can see, I mean, the Jada figure can really get his leg way up there. I mean, he can grab, you see that with the ab crunch and everything involved. It's just a different level of articulation here, which is going to really help in his ability to throw cool like tiger knees. You can really get that knee up there. And then with his chest, with his ab crunch, you can really get into some cool dynamic poses like so. Nice tiger knee shot. you know, and the Storm, you know, it can hit a good tiger knee. I'm not saying that, but it's just not going to hit it, you know, in quite the same way. There's your comparison. That knee can really get up in there. One thing I also did want to point out is that the extension on his double joints are fairly limited because of his sculpt. The bulky bicep doesn't really allow him to get a nice range from the double joint as well as in his knee. Again, as I said, you know, those few degrees more that you can achieve really can help with how dynamic of a pose you can get. So again, these Jada ones just get much more range, and even in his leg, we can see the difference there. And that is maxed out for the Storm Arena. I can't push it anymore. The shorts and the Sculpt just get a little bit in the way of the articulation. And I just wanted to do a quick example of that because I think people weren't understanding what or why I was pointing that out, but it does just provide a little bit, that little extra that you need to get a really cool dynamic pose in some of the Jada articulation. Now, the Jada articulation just has that little bit more in the places that count, like the abdomen and the hips and the knees and the biceps. And it just, I think, marginally is a little bit better in the engineering. The joints feel a lot more solid, less like sticky, less gummy. There's just something about the Storm Arena that the joints don't feel quite as nice. I mean, you can probably hear it. They just don't move as smoothly. You have to kind of fight with it to get it where you need it. Well, the Jada, the engineering is just real nice. Everything is super smooth, and you just don't really have the same problem as the Storm Arena when you're trying to pose. Now, there was the last thing I wanted to touch on is the ankles. Then this might just be my copy. I'm not sure. These are extremely stiff. I even tried to heat them up a little bit. I feel like this one may be misaligned, and I did not want to push it too far as those pegs feel a little bit fragile. But man, mine does not have really any ankle rocking at all. Like, that is about max. There's his feet. You know, the feet are decent, but the ankle rock is a big disappointment, especially when you're trying to get him into some of his iconic poses, and it's like really hard to get these ankles to lay flat. And again, maybe this is just my copy. It could be, but his ankles are very stiff right out of the box. Even with me heating them up a little bit, they gained a little bit more motion, but not much, where the Jada's has really nice ankle rock, really nice articulation on these ankles, as you can see, and that just really helps it, when you're trying to get it in a more dynamic pose, or maybe, his foot needs to lay like that. So that is my quick articulation test, just pointing on the things that are differentiating. And to be honest, most of those differentiating factors are going to be wins for Jada. Now, there are a few points like the butterflies where I think it's close, but maybe Storm inches it out. But there's just something about that Jada figure that poses and moves really well. So overall, I have to say articulation and engineering, I have to give it to Jada. And it might be a race won by inches or maybe a couple feet. That's depending on the kind of collector you are. If you really are into sculpt and aesthetic, I can understand why Storm is your pick. But if you are into articulation and engineering and posing, I completely understand why Jada could be your pick. So again, these things are tough. It really comes down to what kind of collector you are, how you like to play and stand and pose your figures. And in my opinion, the kind of collector that I am, I value the poseability and the playability just a little bit more. And that is why I have to say that I think the Jada Sagat is slightly better. Again, this is marginal. These are nitpicky things, but they're things that really matter to me, as I really love to pose and play with my action figures. Again, you may be different. Let me know down in the comments what you prefer. Are you more of an aesthetic collector where you're okay with it having some limitations in the articulation? Or are you a collector that is really into poseability and really cares for max range out of all the articulation in your figure? Let me know in the comments below. Let me know which one you think is the better figure. And my final thoughts are, I think he's aesthetically beautiful. I think his sculpt and finish is so nice, but I have to admit I'm a bit disappointed in his articulation and overall engineering, especially because Ken, I think, as you can see here, he's not suffering from too many of those problems. Now, this figure, I think, was phenomenal, maybe one of my favorite figures of the year. And as I said in my previous review, this Storm Arena Ken is phenomenal. It's everything I want. It has great articulation. The sculpt and aesthetic is amazing. And then we got the Storm Arena Ryu, which actually I liked a little bit less. I think his sculpt and his accessories were lacking a little bit, and he just didn't feel quite as good as the Ken figure. And then unfortunately, coming in thirds is going to be my Storm Arena Sagat. I think the aesthetic is nice, but I think it sort of feels like they cut corners in the articulation and the engineering. It's just not as smooth. It's not as easy to pose and play with than these two. And for that, I have to say I'm a bit more disappointed. So again, it all comes down to the articulation. Again, I love this figure aesthetically, but I just really can't deny the fact that the articulation falls short. But thanks again, guys, for watching. Let me know what you thought about this video. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And what kind of collector are you? Do you prefer aesthetics over poseability and playability? Or are you the kind of collector like me where you hold a little more weight when it comes to poseability and playability and engineering? Drop a like and a comment. Let me know what you think. And stay tuned for more in-depth reviews of awesome action figures like these.